having to know how we know them. Now let me give you some examples. And what I'm going to do now is give you examples of things I know that come from many areas of knowledge. Okay? I know that there's a podium here in front of me. I know that. I know that I had coffee in my Disneyland mug for breakfast this morning. There's something I know by way of memory. Okay? I know that if P is taller than Q and Q is taller than R, that necessarily P is taller than R. Okay? I know that not only is 2 plus 2 4, but it's necessarily the case that 2 plus 2 is 4. It's impossible for 2 plus 2 not to be 4. Okay? That's something I know. I know that I am now thinking about the problem of skepticism. Right? And I know that I am now conscious and I'm having certain color sensations appearing to me. I know that torturing babies for fun is wrong. I know that. I know that it's wrong to torture little babies by sticking pins in their eyes for the sheer joy of hearing them howl and scream. That's an item of knowledge that I know. By the way, I also know that kindness and tenderheartedness and mercy are virtues, and being vicious, hateful, vengeful, greed-filled people filled with rage is a vice. Those are things I know. Now, I might not be able to tell you how it is I know them, but I do know them. Now, parenthesis. It's important that the things we know be explainable and be at home in our worldview, because if they're not, then our worldview can provide what are called defeaters or problems for our claims to know. And more about that later. But look what the particularist has done. The particularist has simply said, well, look, I might not know a lot about epistemology, and I might not be able to tell you how I know, but I do know, and he lists A, B, C, D, and E. And he selects, or she selects, clear cases of things that he or she knows. Now, the skeptic is going to say this, look, you've begged the question. All you've done is assert that you know things. And now the skeptic asks this question, how do you know such and thus and so? What the skeptic wants to do is to force the particularist to become a Methodist. Because if the particularist bites on the question and becomes a Methodist, the skeptic can run him out of town. Seriously. The game's up, because he can keep asking how you know that. And it's not that he's now practicing an iterative form of skepticism. Now he is merely teasing out the implications intrinsic to the Methodist commitment. You see that? Because the Methodist says, if I can't know such and such without knowing thus and so, then all the skeptic is doing is playing that out. It's saying, given your view, let me just keep asking this. This is your problem, you know. So that's how that goes. Now, what is at stake here between the particularist and the skeptic are different understandings of the intellectual life and knowledge. And here is this chart that I want you to come to now, and I want to try to flesh this out in the time we have left. On the left, in the left-hand column, I've listed the issue that I'll talk about. I will then give you the skeptic's view of that issue, and I'll give you the particularist's view of the issue. The first question is called the burden of proof. This is the issue of whether knowledge has got to be proven before we can claim to have knowledge, or where the burden of proof is on the skeptic to show that we don't have knowledge in general. Who shoulders the burden of proof? Does the person who claims to know some things, in general, have a burden of proof to have to show how he knows it before he can know it? Or does the skeptic have a burden of proof to try to show that the things the particularist claims he knows are things he really doesn't know? Who has the burden of proof here? And the skeptic says it's the particularist. The skeptic says the particularist shoulders the burden of proof. The skeptic says, until you can tell us how you know something, you can't know anything. Now, certainly there are cases where, unless we can tell how we know things, we can't claim to know them. That's certainly true. But what we're talking about is that true throughout our lives? Is that true all throughout our intellectual lives. And the skeptic wants to say that the burden of proof is on the person who says that he knows this, that, or the other. The particularist says the burden of proof is on the skeptic. The particularist says, look, I know I had coffee for breakfast this morning. What would make you think I can't know it? Right? So now what's happened is the particularist shifts the burden of proof onto the skeptic. Now, so this doesn't just turn out to be a game here. Well, you got the burden of proof, you have the burden of proof here, and we just get a shouting match going. We have to try to unpack more of these categories so very different conceptions of the intellectual life emerge. The second issue is the nature of knowledge. For the skeptic, knowledge requires certainty. If you're going to know something, you've got to have certainty about it. And that was Descartes' fundamental mistake. Descartes said to know something, it must be impossible to doubt it. It must be impossible to be wrong about it. And knowledge requires certainty. So for the skeptic, you see, to know something, you have to be certain about it. So I'm not going to go over to the particulars right now. Let's go down the column. That means all the skeptic has to do is to say, well, you might be wrong. Now, what kind of might does the skeptic mean? Well, it's called a logical might. In other words, isn't it logically possible that you're mistaken? And if the skeptic can say, isn't it just logically possible that you're mistaken? Now remember, by logically possible, I just mean there's no contradiction in asserting that I'm mistaken about this. Isn't it possible that you only think you remember having coffee for breakfast this morning, but you didn't have coffee for breakfast? Isn't that logically possible? And the skeptic thinks that that's all that he has to do because knowledge requires certainty, and if he can raise the possibility of error, then you can't know with certainty, and so you don't have knowledge. Now, according to the skeptic, how are we supposed to deal with the skeptic? And to make sense out of this category, I have to compare refuting someone and rebutting them. If you refute someone, you show that they're wrong. If you refute someone, you show that their view is wrong. Okay? If you rebut someone, you don't have to show they're wrong. All you have to do is show they haven't shown they're right. Okay, let's say it again. If you refute somebody, you show they're wrong. That's kind of like in a trial. It's sort of like having to prove the defendant's guilty. Okay? If you rebut someone, you wouldn't have to show the defendant was guilty. You'd have to show that there was no good reason to think he's not guilty. Okay? So to refute someone, you show their view's wrong. If you rebut someone, all you do is show not that their view's wrong, but you show that they haven't shown their view's right. You haven't given me any good reasons for thinking your view's right. Okay? It might be right if I rebutted you, suppose. Suppose you make a claim and I rebut you. Then I'd say, look, your view may be right, but golly day, you haven't given me any reason you have to believe it. So, I mean, come on. If I refuted you, I would have shown your view was false, okay? Now, the skeptic says, I've got to be refuted. Your task, before you can know anything, is to show I'm wrong. Now, you see how this would play out in evangelism if you really took this view? You would have to show, before you could claim to know that mercy was a virtue, let's say, you'd have to be certain about that. And if it's possible that you're mistaken, you wouldn't be able to know it. And what you'd have to do would be to show that the skeptic was wrong. Now, that's a tall order. The particularist takes this differently. And the particularist says that knowledge doesn't require certainty. There are many things we know, but we're not 100% certain about. But that doesn't mean we don't know them. Okay? By 100% certain, that means it's possible that I'm mistaken. All right? But there are many things we know. I know that there's a podium here, even though it's possible that I'm mistaken about it in the bare possibility sense. Now, when the particularist says, I might be mistaken, The particularist uses what's called an epistemic might.